So here's some of the things that we're going to talk about today. It's going to be pretty rapid fire. We're going to look at why great resumes can be deceiving. We're going to talk about why surface level qualifications aren't enough and what churches often miss. We're going to talk about 5 traits of a healthy ministry candidate. We're going to talk about how to spot some red flags early on in the process. We're going to actually look at some questions that reveal the real story, not just what's on the resume. And then we're going to have an opportunity to talk about how we can hire with more confidence and not guesswork. Okay. And then the following is, who the heck are you? I'll introduce myself. I'm Todd Rhodes. I'm one of the co-founders over at chemistrystaffing.com. I've been around ministry for about a little over 30 years, helping pastors and churches navigate transitions and staffing and all of that kind of thing. I'm the original founder at churchstaffing.com and I've been doing the co-founding at Chemistry for, I think, about 8 years already. It's crazy. And also I host the Healthy Church Staff podcast. Maybe some of you have been loyal listeners to that. Thank you if you are. We'll have a link to that in case you want to check that out at the end of the podcast as well. Okay. All right, let's get started. Why even have this webinar? Why does this even matter? Okay. There are a number of reasons. And first of all, and foremost, is most churches hire based on resumes and references and interviews. You try to do your homework, you try to check on the candidate, you try to check the references, you try to do your best and ask the best questions on the interviews. But still, a lot of times, and we talked, some of the questions we did at the beginning of this webinar were, we've actually tried to do it right and we've made some bad hires sometimes, or we've been surprised. So a lot of times you do everything that you think you need to do and you still get surprised 3, 6, 12, 18 months in. You're like, oh my goodness, what happened? What just happened here? We're going to talk about what we can do so that we don't feel like that in the next year. Okay. I'm going to lay some pretty heavy truths on you here. Okay. A healthy hire brings life to your church, but a toxic hire can set you back for years. That's really no surprise, but this might surprise you. Okay. Thankfully, probably you don't get to look at as many ministry resumes as I do. I was thinking about this as I was preparing today. I said as I was preparing, I said, we've reviewed about 10,000 resumes and ministry profiles. That's probably closer to 20,000. We have about 20,000 candidates in our database right now. And the truth is, and this might surprise you, maybe it won't, about 1 in 5 really lines up with who the candidate really is, their real health and their real fit. Okay. And here's what happens. It's the rest, 1 in 5, but the other 80% or so, they either oversell on their resume or they undersell on their resume, or they completely miss the deeper story. And that's, again, why this conversation matters today, because every resume that you look at, every resume is a curated story. You have to remember that. It's just one chapter. It's just one chapter. And it's usually the best chapter of the whole book, right? It's the one with the best lighting. It's the one with absolutely no plot twists. Remember, it's curated. So it's meant to make the candidate look as good as they can. The reality also is that some candidates are really good resume writers. Other candidates are great candidates, but they're not good resume writers. And what you're going to find, and if you've hired in the past, you probably will back me up and say, Todd, you're right on this. Some great fits for your role will have absolutely horrible resumes. Okay. And the adverse is true as well. Some really bad fits are going to have incredibly looking good resumes that are going to really kind of rope you in. The problem is, if they have a horrible resume and they're a great fit, you might not even talk to them because the resume just isn't very good. Okay. So let's talk about a little bit about the limits of a resume. Okay. Because we've already said it's curated. It's the candidate putting their best foot forward. Let's talk about what the resume can and can't do. There are some things that a resume can do, and these are things that a candidate can't really change about themselves. They're facts. So experience, education, and timeline. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we've not seen people fudge their education, because we have. Yes, pastors sometimes, here's a secret. Pastors sometimes fudge their resumes. I was amazed the first time I figured that out, but yeah, sometimes church leaders do that. Sometimes they'll embellish their experience. Remember, it's the best lighting, right? They're painting the best picture. And sometimes the timelines can be a little off. But for the most part, the resume can be a pretty accurate. That doesn't mean you don't go back and check things. But for the most part, with most people, there's going to be red flags other than the resume. Believe me, if they're fudging their resume, you'll find that out if you do some of the things we're saying today. But for the most part, the experience, the education, and the timeline, the resume can give you a really good start, okay, for looking at individual candidates. But there's some things that a resume can't tell you. Looking at the four corners of a resume, at the piece of paper that they send, a resume can't tell you some really important things, right? A resume cannot tell you about the health of the candidate. I'm not just talking about physical health. I'm talking about mental health. I'm talking about spiritual health. I'm talking about physical health. A resume, a piece of paper can't tell you that. It can't tell you how they work with a team. It can't tell you that. It can't tell you what kind of baggage they have at their current church and why they're wanting to leave, or what baggage that they may bring to your new church or your new position. Four corners of the resume cannot tell you about emotional maturity, okay? And they can't tell you about how they approach leadership. They can't tell you how good of a leader they are, or even what their leadership style is. Are they a bulldozer? They're just going to come in and ram everybody over, or are they a really thoughtful leader? Or can they not lead their way out of a paper bag? A resume can't tell you that. It can give you an illusion of what that might be, but that illusion might be totally inaccurate. So I would really encourage you, if you are hiring, to really put out of your head, okay, starting right now, put it out of your head, the myth of the perfect resume. Because here's another truth. Sometimes the most polished candidates, the candidates that have the nicest resume, the candidates that you think, man, I really need to tell. Sometimes the most polished candidates are the most practiced at hiding any kind of red flags. So I'm sure you're thinking, Todd, this is really encouraging. Thanks so much for telling us that resumes are pretty much worthless and we have a big problem here. It's going to get better. I promise, because we're going to start to talk about how to spot a healthy candidate. And there are really 5 different areas that we look at. And I would encourage you, as you're filtering through resumes and deciding who to talk to, as you start to talk to people. Let me backtrack just a second. We talked about great possible fits might have really horrible looking resumes. Your temptation is going to be, I don't even want to have a conversation with them, or if their experience and their education and their abilities seem to line up on the resume, but their resume looks bad, it's probably worth a conversation. With one conversation, you're going to be able to dig a little deeper and really hone in on some of these 5 areas we're going to talk about here on how to spot a healthy candidate. So you can spot a healthy candidate, and sometimes healthy candidates honestly just have really bad looking resume. We found that out in the past. All right, 5 different things to look for as you spot a healthy candidate. The first is you're going to look for self-awareness. Healthy candidates know their strengths, but they also know their weaknesses. They're just as clear about their weaknesses as they are about their strengths. They don't need to pretend to be somebody they're not, and they don't need to be the smartest person in the room. If you've interviewed a lot of candidates, you probably have met people that just can't read the room. They have very little self-awareness. And the key phrase here is they know who they are and they know who they're not. They don't try to be everything to everybody. Here's some signs to look for in conversations. Are they open about past mistakes? Do they actually admit that they have ever made a mistake? Do they give credit to others? Those are really important things to look for when you're looking at self-awareness and humility of a candidate. And here's a sample question that I think you could ask during an interview, even a first round interview with somebody that you're interested in or trying to figure out if they might be a good fit. Ask a question something like this. What's something that you've learned that you've had to unlearn in ministry? What's something you've had to unlearn in ministry? How did that process shape you as a leader? And I tell you, if they can't come up with something that they either did wrong or something that they've had to unlearn, it's either because, man, they're just a really good candidate. They've never made a mistake, or there could be a problem with some self-awareness there. So self-awareness and humility is the first thing to look for in order to help spot a healthy candidate. The second is emotional maturity. These are the candidates that can handle hard conversations. They can own their part in conflict, and they're not going to crumble under feedback. They're secure. They're not fragile. So you're going to want to find out, can they manage conflict well? If they've been in ministry longer than about 3 minutes, they probably had to manage conflict. How do they do that? Can they take feedback, or do they get defensive? And find out what their past team would say about them as well. That's really important. So here's a statement that you can use in a first round interview that'll help you determine a little bit more about the emotional maturity of a candidate. So here's what you can say. You can say, tell me about a time that you received tough feedback from a supervisor or a board member. How did you respond to that? Really important to listen to their answer. It's going to tell you a lot about who they are and about their emotional maturity as well. Okay, we're going to talk about next. Number 3 is relational strength. We're talking about how to spot healthy candidates. Healthy leaders build trust and unity. They're not just tolerated by their teams, they're respected and they're enjoyed. So you're going to look for joy in collaboration, not solo leadership. If they appear by some of the questions you're answering, they always talk about just themselves and how they did things rather than how they worked on a team or worked collaboratively, that might be a flag for you. So pay attention to how they talk about their coworkers, how they talk about their staff at their current church or their past church, and how they talk about board members. If you're hiring a senior pastor, if they're throwing a lot of board members under the bus, it might just be a matter of time before they're throwing you under the bus if you hire them. One question you can ask for relational strength: how would people who have worked under you describe your leadership style? Okay, that's really an interesting question. And then when you get to the reference part and you start calling references, you can ask them as well, what did you think of their leadership style? So that's relational strength you're going to want to look at. Number 4, calling and stability. I feel like I'm zooming here, but there's a lot to go over. You're going to want to help spot a healthy candidate. You're going to look at their calling and stability, because you're not looking for somebody who's just chasing the next opportunity, who just wants a job. You want somebody who sees your church as a place to plant, a place to grow, and a place to stay. So what you're really trying to discern during the interview process is this person looking for just a job, or are they looking for a place to belong and kind of lead faithfully? We call that at Chemistry, we call that a healthy long-term fit. And when we say healthy long-term fit, we're talking 5 years or more. We try and find candidates that can stay in a church, in a healthy church, as a healthy staff member for 5 years or more. And you can ask also, do they have a pattern of long-term service, or have they jumped around a lot? If they've been in 5 different roles over the past 10 years, you can do the simple math there. 10 roles in 5 years, that's 2 years apiece. You can do the math. If you hire them, they'll probably stay where you are for about 2 years as well. All right, last one, then we'll move on. How to spot a healthy candidate. We're going to talk about number 5, which is calling and stability. And what has kept you in a ministry role when things got hard, and what would cause you to leave? The calling and stability. Oh, we were just talking about that. Yeah, that's a question you can ask for calling and stability. Stability is just what's kept you in a ministry role, and when things got hard, and what would cause you to leave. When we do interviews, we ask usually the last 2 or 3 positions, according to how long those positions they were in those positions, why they left those positions. And that's really a calling and stability type question. Number 5, gospel-centered leadership without the ego. Healthy leaders lift up Jesus, not themselves. They lead with conviction, but they don't need to be the hero. It's just not just about what they lead, it's how they lead. And do they platform Jesus, or do they platform themselves? So here's the question you can ask in this ego question. How do you keep your role centered on Jesus rather than yourself, especially when you're the one on stage or you're the one leading the change? It's a really important question, and it's going to help you to spot whether or not they have gospel-centered leadership or whether they're off the board with ego. All right, now we're going to talk about how to spot some toxic traits before they begin. So this is a really, really interesting section, and we're going to talk about, and these are going to show up If they don't show up, you need to have these show up in the interview. And the download that we have at the end is going to give you some questions that you can drill in to make sure that you can spot these toxic traits. Because I'm telling you, if you don't spot them in the interview, they're going to show up. Probably not in week 1 or week 2, but by the 3rd month, by the 6th month, and then a year, 18 months in, as these toxic traits, as they get to be more comfortable in your setting, this is where they're really going to come to haunt you, and where you're going to scratch your head and say, oh my goodness, what kind of a bad decision did I make when I hired this person? So just go through these really quick. Toxic traits. The first one is blame shifting. You can identify this in an interview. Things never seem to be their fault. Every problem is somebody else's fault, and it's usually the last church. So really, what we touched on this before, watch when they talk about why they're leaving their church, watch about how much they blame shift. Is the whole reason they're leaving because of somebody else? And the question I turn around on somebody that says, hey, this person did that, my elder board did that, is I ask them, what did you learn? What have you learned through this process? Or another great killer question here is, what would you do differently? If you had to do it all over again, they just already shifted blame. If you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? And what did you learn as a result of that process? Blame shifting is huge. Over defensiveness. Even when you ask a gentle or a fair question, they respond just over defensively. We've had quite a few people that we've talked to over the years that we ask just a really benign question, and all of a sudden they're like on the defensive big time. It's, oh my goodness, we hit a nerve, and sometimes we try to hit a nerve, but especially if we're not trying to ask anything controversial or really dig in yet, and they get over defensive, that can be an issue. You need to try and have your spidey senses up for that if that happens on an interview, because if it happens on an interview or on an on-site visit, you can bet it's going to show up in spades later on. Another toxic trait you need to watch out for is if they have no lasting relationships. So they've been in multiple roles, that on their resume, but they can't point to any people who will still vouch for them. Even if they're leaving a bad situation, say they're leaving a church that maybe even they got fired, right? And you still are talking to them. Even in the worst situation, they should have somebody there that will vouch for them. A volunteer, a friend that was under their ministry that could, if you can't find anybody that'll vouch for them from their last ministry, that's a flag. So no lasting relationships. What if they give you vague or evasive answers? Have you ever been in an interview and you ask a question and they just talk around the question? They don't ever give you an answer. If they dodge or they deflect or they give even overly polished answers, especially when they're asked about a conflict or about any kind of transition, if you just feel like they're trying to lead you off the path or throw you a curveball, that could lead to, there could be something a little bit more you need to dig into. Could be totally a flag. Over spiritualizing. This is interesting because we get this often too. Again, we talk to candidates all day long, and whenever somebody pulls out the God card, it's always whoop, throw a flag on that one. Not that God doesn't tell people to do things and that we're not open to the Holy Spirit, but if someone over spiritualizes things, like God told me to do this type of language to justify decisions or specifically to avoid accountability or any kind of challenge, that could be a really toxic trait that you're going to want to watch out for. And again, you can find most of these by asking really good questions during the interview. Another one is charisma without character. And I've got one more after this. They impress in the moment, but there's no spiritual depth or track record to show the support. Have you ever interviewed somebody and man, they're just a charmer? You're instantly attracted. They're like, man, this guy or this gal, she's awesome. But you peel back the layer and it's all kind of personality. There's not really anything to back it up, particularly in character. You need to make sure that their character matches their charm. Don't be charmed by their charm. That will come back to haunt you if you're not careful. And then here's a bonus tip. And we're talking about spotting toxic traits. Look for patterns, not isolated incidents. Okay. For example, someone might be coming off a really bad church experience, and it might not be their issue. Churches sometimes can, another secret, churches sometimes can be cruel. Churches sometimes can be unfair. Churches sometimes can chew up and spit out pastors and staff people. And you might get a candidate that is just coming off a really bad experience, but it's an isolated incident. Okay. They may have been in 3 different churches and the other 2 churches were great. It may have just been a bad church. Now, if there's 3 bad experiences, and we were talking to somebody just a couple of weeks ago that had 3 kind of consecutive runs, and each one of them was just didn't have a good thing to say about any of the churches. That's a pattern. It doesn't mean that he wasn't in 3 bad churches or she wasn't in 3 bad churches, but it does mean you got to do a little bit more investigation there. So, Todd, what can I do differently? And something just happened to my screen there. There we go. What can I do differently? A few ideas here for you. And the first is just a shift from resume-based to health-based hiring. So you need to look beyond the credentials. And by the credentials, the things that we talked about that you can find on the resume, look beyond those and look at character and chemistry and calling. Use tools that will assess culture fit and self-awareness and leadership health. There's a number of tools out there. At Chemistry, I'm going to go through in just a second some of the tools that we use or some of the areas that we look at. But those tools, besides the interviews, outside of the interviews, are going to help you to be able to evaluate some of these self-awareness and leadership health and cultural fit issues that you have. So that's another tip. And then don't skip the references. I can't tell you how many churches that have come to us and said, we made a bad hire. And one of the reasons we made a bad hire in retrospect is we didn't really check the references. You need to check the references and ask really honest questions and actually follow up with the references. We're actually amazed sometimes we get a reference. We'll ask a candidate for references and they'll give us references and the reference will come back as incredibly truthful, but they're raising all these flags because they just lived it with this candidate. This candidate is never on time. He has character issues. Would you hire him? No. And yet the candidate was not self-aware enough to know that this would not be a good reference. So make sure that references are another framing point for you as you look at different candidates and determine whether or not they're going to be a good fit for you. It's always good to involve multiple voices in the interview process. Health shows up differently to different people. You can have, let's say, 5 people on your search team, and everybody's going to walk away from an interview with a different view. And all those views are valid and all those views need to be heard. And it's good to have an interview with a search team, but it's also good to have interviews with staff, individuals, volunteers, and get as much input as you can. Team-based interviews reveal what one person might miss. So that's really important. And know your church's real needs before you fall in love with the resume. So know what kind of leader you're actually looking for. If you don't do the homework before you start the search, if you don't know exactly what your church needs, not what your church wants, what your church needs, those a lot of times can be 2 totally different things. If you don't know what your church needs and you start interviewing candidates, you're going to be kind of willy-nilly on because you're going to be charmed by the charm. You're going to meet somebody that, yeah, they're not exactly what we were thinking we were looking for, but man, they're funny. They're good looking. They have a good personality. They've done this before at a larger church, all that kind of thing. You just need to know exactly what you're looking for, what you need before you start, or else your criteria is going to change over time. Believe me, that's a big mistake a lot of churches make. So what do we do next? Pulling this all together, and then we'll go to some of your questions. All right. What to do next? Shameless plug. Considering inviting chemistry staffing to help you assess candidate health. We assess candidate health. Here's how we do it. I don't mean to be I'm not a sales guy, okay? But let me tell you how we do it. And we do all of these things to help churches mitigate bad hires. We want to make sure that you don't hire somebody that's not going to be a good theology fit or a culture fit. So these are the pillars that we look at, and we'd love to help you with your search if you need help. But theological alignment, you have to have theological alignment. These are the 5 things that we say to candidates and churches. You got to have these 5 things if you want to hire well. And if you're a staff member, you need to have these 5 things in your church if you want to be able to stay long term. If you even miss one of these, it's probably going to be a shorter tenure than what you wanted it to be. The first is theological alignment. You just have to have that. Does this candidate believe what your church believes on key issues that matter to you? So my example here is, if you as a church believe in the virgin birth and you hire somebody that you didn't vet them theologically and you find out 3 months in that they don't believe in the virgin birth, guess how long that's going to last? It shouldn't have lasted 3 months, right? So you need to make sure that there's theological assessments. How we do this at Chemistry is, before we even talk to candidates and before we start a search with a church, is we run through a theological assessment. It's 25 questions, yes, no, that kind of help us know where your church is and where each candidate is on theology, key theological things, so that we can put them together and try and find a good match. So theology is incredibly important. Second is the cultural alignment. We call this church culture and DNA. And the question there is, will they thrive in the unique culture of your church? Every church's culture is different. So think communication style, think leadership dynamics, think worship preferences, even things like pace of ministry. Are you guys slow and deliberate, or are you like fast, we're going to charge every hill? All of that factors into cultural alignment. And you need to have candidates, and if you're a candidate, you need to find a church that matches you culturally, and both culturally, like regionally. Somebody said that one of the things they wish they knew was the connection between how well a candidate did in a job, because they weren't a part of that they weren't a part of that culture, right? Even regionally. So all of that, regional culture, church culture, all of that DNA stuff is vitally important. You have to have theology, you have to have cultural alignment, you have to have a personality and wiring fit. So are they naturally gifted and motivated for the role that you're looking for? And we assess them by their behavioral profile, their strengths, and how they're wired to lead and serve. Okay. So again, we're at Chemistry, if you're working with us, we're doing the assessment piece. We're doing a theology assessment, and it's all free for candidates. Theology assessment, culture assessment, we're doing a personality assessment. You just have to be able to have the skills and abilities, the competency and the experience to do the job. Can they do the job? Do they have the ministry skills, the leadership capacity? Do they have the history to back it up? And then chemistry. That's why we named ourselves Chemistry. Chemistry is the unique combination of all of these things: the cultural alignment, the personality fit, the relational style, that really determines whether a candidate will truly click with your church's environment. And this chemistry piece is something that only you and the candidate can figure out. It's boots on the ground. It's sharing a meal. It's going to a service together. It's hearing them preach if they're a pastor. It's meeting with volunteers. It's meeting with staff. It's really, do I want to do ministry with this person? And do they want to do ministry with us? Do I want to have this person and their family over to my house for a barbecue on Tuesday night? Those kind of things. Chemistry is vitally important. So if you can get to a point where you can land on all 5 of those, and you got green lights on all 5 of those, chances are you're going to make a really good hire. And that's really what we're going for with our work at Chemistry and what we've given our lives to here at Chemistry. So my question for you is, how confident are you in your current hiring process? You don't have to put this in the chat, but as you've gone through your past experiences and then some of the things that we went over today that hopefully will help you move from where you are now to where you need to be, how confident are you in your hiring process right now? Like a 1 to 10, just come up with a number. Okay. And here's what I would say is, if your number that you came up with is anything less than an 8, I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to talk with you. Maybe you're navigating a new search right now. You're getting ready to start a search. Maybe you're in the middle of a search. Doesn't make any difference. I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to see if there's any way that we can work together. It's that chemistrystaffing.com. There we go, /connect. And just click on that, and you can schedule 30 minutes with me for your church. And I would be happy. Matter of fact, I would love to talk with you. We're going to do questions next. And this is the first time I'm seeing these. So this is it's actually my favorite part, the webinar. And sometimes my answers are really good, and sometimes they're just really bad. No, I don't know. Hopefully they're good. Hopefully they're good for you today. All right. How do you avoid a church that doesn't know what they need? All right. So this is from Ken. Ken's asking a question. I assume, Ken, that you're a candidate, you're a job seeker. So how do you avoid a church? So everything that I've shared today is from a church's perspective. You could also take that and just flip it, do the inverse, and ask the same questions. If you're a candidate looking for a new job at a church, you can ask these same type of questions to them. You need to make sure that they know what they need. And you can ask pretty simple questions like, what are you looking for? What are your expectations? What does success look like in the first 6 months or the first year? If they don't have a good answer for that, chances are they're not quite sure what they need yet. And I would say, Ken, this is really important for you as a candidate, as a job seeker, because I can't tell you how many churches start their job search without really having a clear idea what they're looking for. And maybe you've interviewed at a church like that or two. You really need to ask those questions. So don't be afraid as a job seeker to ask those questions as well. Let's see what else. Let's see. Kevin asks, again, I'm just reading this as I'm saying it. So we'll see if I have an answer for it. Kevin asks, if a candidate has some baggage, would you advise they be candid about it and address it right away in the cover letter, resume, or wait to share it in the interview? That's a really good question. I don't know if you're asking this from a church standpoint, from a hiring standpoint, or from a job seeker standpoint. Let me tell you what I tell candidates, okay? If there is something that you know is going to be brought up, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's you were let go from your last position, maybe it's any of those types of things that you're going to get it. Maybe it's a gap in your resume. Maybe you worked in a church for 15 years, and then maybe you took a 3-year break and sold insurance, and now you're getting back into ministry. Those kind of things that are blatant from looking at your resume, I would address in a cover letter. And the cover letter these days usually isn't a piece of paper. It's usually the email that you're sending along with your resume. There are ways to do that. If you don't do it in the cover letter, just know that it's going to come up in your interview. And what I tell candidates or job seekers is, if you know you're going to get a question, make sure that you've practiced your answer to that. You're going to get the question, have an elevator pitch, 2 minutes or less, no more than 2 minutes. I tell people, make sure, write it down on paper. Make sure, I see you're divorced. Tell me a little bit about the divorce. Great. You've got 2 minutes. If you don't practice that answer, even though you know you're going to get the question, you are going to ramble and it's going to be a horrible mess. And guess what? The next 25 minutes of your interview are going to be talking about your divorce. So that's how I would answer that. If you're from a church standpoint, yeah, I would want to know if they don't mention anything, if you're a church looking at a resume and a cover letter and they don't mention anything, you're going to need to read between the lines. Like I mentioned, a gap in ministry, you're going to ask those type of questions. One of the things that we do is we ask a lot of those questions up front so that we get, before we even talk to a potential candidate for your church, we've got like 110 points of data on them, all their theological and cultural things, but all their family information, all of that. So we know some of the questions to ask there. If they have put disclaimers in their cover letter, it might be a red flag, a big enough red flag that you're just out of the running, and that could be. Otherwise, they've mentioned it. If everything else looks good, you're going to want to have that conversation, right? Don't just take what they say. Right, let's see. How to say no to inquiries. Not a good fit. We have some templates that we use according to why a candidate's not a good fit. Quite honestly, I like that you're asking the question about how to say no, because most churches don't say no. They just string candidates along and never tell them that they're out of the running, even after a first or second conversation. That's one of my pet peeves. Churches really need to be good communicators to every candidate. And the farther they go down the path with you, if they send in a resume, you should be able to send them a nice email back. If they don't meet the qualifications, you could just, in a very nice way, say, unfortunately, we're going to continue to look other places because we're looking for other qualifications that you don't have. If you talk to them, do a video interview or a phone interview, that kind of ups the level of, you need to communicate nicely back to them. If you do a site visit, you absolutely have to be really good communicators. And will they be upset? Yeah, maybe. maybe, but you need to be honest and you need to care for not only your church, but you need to care for the candidate. And a no for them might sting a little bit, but it's also a little bit of clarity for them so that they know that it's not going to work out at your church and they can move on to another church. So, Mike, I hope that helped a little bit. Any other questions? Go ahead and bring them out. How do you flush out if a candidate is being honest or not? So, Greg asked this. Great question. Greg, sometimes it's more discernment. It's more kind of reading between the lines when you're talking to somebody because you don't know them. You might talk to somebody for an hour on a first round interview and you don't know, other than if you're a body language expert, whether or not they're telling you a truth or a lie. Some pastors are very skilled at mistruths. I will say that. It's easy to get duped if you're not careful. And again, it's one of the reasons why you need to really be careful to contact references. If you're talking with somebody, you really like them, you ask them for references and they put you off. We get this more than what you would think, where we're a couple conversations in, we really like the person, we ask for references and they're like, they ghost us. If a candidate ghosts you when you ask for references, that's a flag. But references are a really good insight into who this candidate is from a different perspective. Now, some people were going to say they're going to give you their friends and the people that they're closest to. Yeah, that's true. But here's what we found with references is that references are going to be honest for the most part, right? And if you have 3 or 4, we ask for 4 to 5 references. If you have 4 to 5 references, and you ask them the right questions, you're going to get a pretty good representation of who this person is, and whether or not your confidence in their truthfulness goes up or down will depend a lot on what those references have to say. And again, don't underestimate just the feeling that you get that something's not right if somebody's not telling you the truth, but they'll get caught in it. But you need to do that as much as you can and as quickly as you can during that interview process. You don't want to hold that off. If you have any questions on integrity, don't make the hire until you have confirmation on the integrity. Okay. A couple more questions here. I don't know if they're popping these in, Kelly, at the top. Or yeah, it looks like it. What's the average? I love this one. Sarah asks, what's the average time from receiving a resume to hire? I feel like my team is slow in the interview process, but maybe not. So from the time that you receive the resume to the hire, this has changed. If you're on the resume or on the webinar last month, we talked about 10 things that we've seen change in the past year. One of the things is that it's a candidate's market. What I don't want you to tell your team is we got to FedEx this, we got to fast forward this and just move it too fast. You don't want to, you still want to do your due diligence. You still want to check the references, but you can't take 2 months from the time you get the resume until the time that you actually make a hire, because candidates have a lot of options because it's a candidate's market. So what I tell churches and what I tell candidates is that you're really honest with each other. And if you're a church, that you have intentional next steps. So maybe you get the resume within 5 to 7 days of getting that resume, you need to decide, yes, this is somebody we want to talk to, or no, it's not. You need to schedule that. And once you have that first conversation, make sure that you schedule your next. Don't leave people in limbo. You got to keep it moving. What you're going to find is particularly the really good candidates, the candidates that are going to shine, the candidates that you're going to want to hire, they're going to have options and they're going to be talking to multiple churches. So it's really important to keep the process going. So how long should it take? Ideally, I would say 30 days to have a first or a second interview from the time you get that resume. You can do it less. You can do it. We're just headed into summer and summer schedules get crazy. But the quicker you can do it without feeling rushed is better. If you're taking longer than 60 days, chances are from the time that you get the resume, chances are they're probably already finding another church. That's good. Chris asks, what time is it? So we got a couple more minutes here. Chris asks, a candidate has a good long-term history at a church, but then 2 other churches for less than 2 years. Is this a red flag? They listed several references. You've given me a lot of information there, Chris. And this is a good example. You want to look at not just the instance, you want to look at the reoccurrence of this. You're going to want to dig in. So if somebody's been at a church for 10 years, that tells me a lot about a candidate. That tells me that they have a certain amount of longevity. It tells me that they're somewhat likable, that they can stay in a church and stay employed for 10 years. So that's a good thing. You're going to want to look at the last 2 if they've only been there a couple years, and you're going to want to dig in with some references, and you're going to have to have some hard conversations with the candidate about, all right, so why did you leave? Just ask really point blank, nicely, of course. But all right, so you were at First Baptist here, and you were only there for 18 months, Joe. Tell me what happened. And listen to their story. And then put it through that filter of all those toxic traits that we saw. See if any of those start to pop up as he talks about why he was only at a church for 18 months. And then the last church, hey, you've only been at this church for 2 years. Why are you thinking about, it's only been 2 years. Why are you talking to us? And listen for some of those toxic things. It could be that it was just a bad match. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes that's a candidate's fault. Sometimes it's not a candidate's fault. What you need to determine during the interview process is, what the real story is there. You can get some of that from the candidate, but you could also get some of that from the references. And you say that this person has listed several references, probably at both of those shorter term churches and maybe one at the long-term church. Ask those. And I would also ask, just like you're asking the last 2 positions why they left, ask it for the 10-year position too. Ask them, say something like, you were at this church for almost a decade. Why did you leave that? Sounds like it was a great church. Okay. So very good. Let me see what else I've got here. If I've got anything else. If being told no by a church, is it appropriate to ask why? Yeah, absolutely. And here's what we find is that if you don't ask why, most churches won't tell you, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. We have candidates that we tell no every day. And a lot of them will not push back. They'll just say, hey, could you give me a little bit more insight? I'm trying to learn what happened, what didn't happen, and what should I do there? So it's not inappropriate to ask why. It's more how you ask it. And we've also had candidates come back and say, I can't, essentially, sometimes in these words, I can't believe that you told me no for this because I am the perfect fit for this church. And you hear the defensiveness come out? We talked about that earlier. So some of that is how it's asked. But yeah, if you don't, it's totally appropriate to ask. I've only heard one church in 8 years that said that they would not tell a candidate why. So most churches are going to be open and honest, and they want to answer your questions. Boy, lots and lots of good questions here. If I don't get to your question, there'll be a slide at the very end of this where you can email me your question. I'll try and answer as many of those as I can via email as well. Let's ask this one for Joel, and then we'll finish up here. How would you cover being forced to resign by a senior pastor trying to distract from the moral failure he was trying to hide? Whew, let me tell you, I have, as I go back to my bio, I've been in ministry for over 30 years, and I tell you what, there's nothing that surprises me. As you're talking with a potential church, Joel, and you just came off a bad experience, it's a fine line. You don't want to just throw the senior pastor under the bus, okay? But most pastors, some search committee members, but most pastors, most pastoral staff, if you have some staff on your search committee that you're having an interview with, they're going to know the stories too, and nothing's going to surprise them. Again, this is where it's really important to have references that can back up your story. So tread lightly. Chances are, if you just were forced to resign, you're probably angry about it. Make sure you don't come off angry. Tell them exactly as factually as you can what happened, and then say, hey, don't take my word for it. I've got a couple people that I'd be more than happy to have you talk with that can confirm or tell you a little bit more, give you some more details as to what happened there. Okay. All right. Hopefully that was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, I'll give you an email address here in just a second. I tell you what, if after watching and listening to this webinar, if you have any questions, any way that you think that I might be able to help you in your church, particularly when it comes to hiring or keeping away from these toxic hires, I'd love to spend 30 minutes with you on a Zoom call just to hear your story, hear where you're at as a church, and see if there's any way that I can help you. You can click on that link there just to schedule some time, pick some time on my calendar. I'd love to be able to do that. All right, a couple other things as we wrap up here. If you're enjoying this type of conversation, we do this every day on the Healthy Church Staff podcast, every Monday through Friday. You can click on that link. It'll take you. You can subscribe to that absolutely free. It's about 5 to 8 minutes every day. You get some Todd time every day. We talk about all different kinds of things, hiring, firing, but also just anything that would interest you as a staff member. I think you would really enjoy the podcast as well. All right. And if you still have questions, if I didn't get to your question or you get off this webinar and you're like, man, I would love to ask this question, but I forgot, or I didn't think of it until now, just email me anytime, podcast@chemistrystaffing.com, podcast@chemistrystaffing.com, and I will be happy to try and answer your question for you. Okay. I hope this has been helpful for you. If you're on a search team or you regularly hire staff, any way I can help you, just reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. All right. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.